my perception of Abu Dhabi came entirely from what other people said. And what people used to say was it's quiet, it's slower, there's not much happening, it's boring. And I remember hearing that so often that I didn't even question it. And then I spent some time there. And I remember thinking, this feels completely different to what I have been told. It covers roughly 84% of the UAE's land area. So Abu Dhabi is sitting at around 4.1 million residents, and projections are pointing towards 5.4 million by 2040. ADIA alone manages assets around $1 trillion. When I see the scale of capital underpinning that economy in Abu Dhabi, it really gives a sense of resilience. Now, between 2025 and 2029, Abu Dhabi is projected to deliver roughly 45,000 new units. When you compare that to Dubai's pipelines, which exceeds 400,000 units, you begin to see how controlled Abu Dhabi feels by comparison. What emerges is not noise or hype. It feels very deliberate. It feels layered. It feels like longevity. Before we get into today's episode, I want to share something quickly. After building my last podcast, the Health Formula Show, to over 400 episodes, I realized something pretty crazy. Over 70% of the people listening to it weren't actually subscribed. And that matters because if you're serious about learning, staying consistent, and actually applying what you hear, subscribing makes a huge difference. So if you're serious about investing, creating long-term financial freedom for yourself, and making smarter, more informed decisions, hit the subscribe button. It really helps the show, and more importantly, it makes sure that you don't miss what's coming next. Welcome back! I've been wanting to sit down and record this episode for a while because Abu Dhabi is one of those places that people talk about in fragments, right? Someone mentions beaches, someone mentions prices, someone mentions visas, someone mentions returns, but rarely does anyone just pause for a second. Personally, I have realized that the whole picture usually matters way more than any single number or brochure or project, to be honest with you. And for a long time, my perception of Abu Dhabi came entirely from what other people said. And what people used to say was it's quiet, it's slower, there's not much happening, it's boring. And I remember hearing that so often that I didn't even question it. And then I spent some time there, properly, not just flying in and out, not just a weekend, but a full week where I was just walking around, driving around, speaking to people that live there, both locals and non-locals. And I remember thinking, this feels completely different to what I have been told. I really fell in love. I fell in love with Abu Dhabi. The coastline felt so natural. The beaches didn't feel overly constructed. No traffic. Barely any traffic. The air felt amazing, so fresh, so natural, just different. And I thought to myself, I can see myself living here in the future. And because Dubai is just an hour away, you have both options available. And some days you want movement, some days you want pure stillness. Personally, I realized I really like stillness way more than I thought I did. So after that, I started looking into Abu Dhabi more seriously from a property perspective. And I realized how big the emirate actually is. Physically big. It covers roughly 84% of the UAE's land area. And there are over 200 islands and about 700 kilometers of coastline. And that's a lot. And when you first hear those numbers, they sound a little bit abstract. But when you actually drive around or you go out by boat, you really start to feel that scale. And it really changes the way that you think about development because it's not just density, right? There's actual space for planning rather than just squeezing projects into whatever land is left. And then the population side of it kept coming back into my mind as well. So Abu Dhabi is sitting at around 4.1 million residents, growing roughly 7 to 7.5% year on year. And projections are pointing towards 5.4 million by 2040. And so when growth is steady like that, housing demand doesn't just spike and crash, it builds layer by layer. People relocate for work, they stay longer than expected, they form households, and gradually renting transitions into ownership. So it feels more like watching a tide come in rather than a wave crash. Then the demographic detail that stayed with me was really the average age being around 33, because that's the stage where people are building careers, they are renting longer, and they are just figuring out, where they want to settle before truly committing to ownership. And so that internal demand matters a lot because it creates continuity. And one thing that I didn't realize as well was that it's not just international investors flying in and out. There's a resident base growing within the city itself. And then another layer that I hadn't fully appreciated at the start was the sovereign wealth present behind that economy, behind the Abu Dhabi economy. You hear names like ADIA, Murabala, ADQ, and unless you actually pause and look into it, research into it, just sounds like random names, random institutions. But ADIA alone manages assets around $1 trillion. That is an extraordinary level of liquidity sitting behind diversification strategies in technology, infrastructure, healthcare, and energy. Personally, when I see the scale of capital underpinning that economy in Abu Dhabi, it really gives a sense of resilience of my money is safe there. Markets still move. They always do, but they rarely feel fragile, right? And then there's ADGM, the Abu Dhabi Global Market. And for a long time, I only knew it as an acronym, and I remember thinking, what is that? But then once I understood it, it just clicked. So it's essentially a financial district with its own legal framework operating under English common law. So that's attracting banks, asset managers, corporate headquarters, and family offices. It's considered the largest financial district in the entire of the Middle East, with over 11,000 active licenses. And what that translates to in property terms is very simple. Executive level tenants, corporate leasing, multi-year relocations, and over time, many of those tenants become buyers. So rental demand and ownership demand start feeding into each other naturally. And it's not just tourism or short-term stays. You can clearly see this is salary-backed housing demand. And then we have infrastructure, which plays a quieter role, but it's significant. The Etihad rail network is one example. It doesn't sound glamorous, no, but travel time changes how people choose where to live. So areas that once felt distant suddenly feels very reasonable. And so that shift influences land values without much noise. It just gradually happens. And then on top of that, you have cultural and entertainment investments. We know that Disney is coming, SeaWorld, Ferrari World, Warner Bros. We have the Louvre Museum. So we have multiple ongoing attraction pipelines that keep expanding. And this is key because they create employment ecosystems and reasons for residents to stay longer. Let me pause for 10 seconds because I've created something that might really help you out. It's called the First Time UAE Property Buyers Blueprint, a practical guide to how international investors buy off-plan in Dubai and Abu Dhabi step by step. The link is in the show notes below or below this video if you're watching this on YouTube. Now, when people say rental markets, they stabilize almost organically. Supply then inevitably enters the conversation, obviously, right? Because it's always part of the risk equation. Now, between 2025 and 2029, Abu Dhabi is projected to deliver roughly 45,000 new units, about 11.9 thousand in 2025, and then 33,000 across the following years. When you compare that to Dubai's pipelines, which exceeds 400,000 units, you begin to see how controlled Abu Dhabi feels by comparison. Lower incoming inventory doesn't guarantee appreciation, but it does reduce the risk of oversaturation. And if you go one layer deeper and look at existing stock versus construction pipeline, there are roughly 90,000 existing units and around 33,000 under construction, meaning future supply is about 27% of the current market. That imbalance often gives early investors stronger pricing power because absorption happens faster, right? So it's not about rushing into anything, but it's really about recognizing when demand begins to outpace delivery. And then timing also plays a role. So Dubai introduced freehold ownership around 2008, whereas Abu Dhabi opened freehold areas around 2019. So in freehold terms, Abu Dhabi is only about 6 years into this cycle. And I remember thinking that this is roughly equivalent to where Dubai was around 2012, 2015. Not identical, obviously, but similar in terms of like early stage appreciation curves. For international investors, residency obviously sometimes does become part of the picture as well. And that is where we have the Golden Visa framework, which allows 10-year renewable residency tied to property purchases of 2 million dirhams or more. The ability to sponsor family members and in some cases secure mortgage financing. The process itself is very procedural, so it's not discretionary at all. So that gives you a sense of clarity. It's something called an EOI. And a lot of people ask me, what is an EOI? What does that mean? That means an expression of interest. And so all you need to know about this is that it's just a fully refundable deposit placed before a project officially launches. So it just shows intent and it gives you priority in the allocation queue. And then on launch day, what happens is that people with EOIs are contacted in sequence and then they choose their unit from the released price list and the EOI amount is deducted from the booking. If they don't proceed, it's refunded. It's more about positioning rather than commitment. And then you have payment plans that are another area where Abu Dhabi feels different from what some investors expect. There are construction-linked plans, there are time-based installments, and there are post-handover plans extending payments after the keys are received, right? One small but very important detail is a 2% Abu Dhabi municipality registration fee, usually paid at booking and then often excluded, right, from the property price. If you compare that to Dubai, where installments can sometimes reach 24% within the first 12 weeks, Abu Dhabi plans are often spread over 18 to 24 months before handover, which really influences your cash flow quite a bit, right? And obviously the yields. The Abu Dhabi rental yields have ranged roughly between 6.6% to 9.5%, obviously depending on the timing and the asset classes. There was, yes, a gradual compression down to around 6.6% in 2023, but then followed by a rebound towards 7.5% more recently as rents began rising way faster than prices. Now, what stood out to me was the consistency, okay? Because stability usually suggests end user demand rather than just like purely speculative cycles. And even at the lower end, these returns often outperform major global cities like London or Singapore, which is why yield-focused investors find the markets in Abu Dhabi very lucrative. Now, when I step back and I look at everything together, the macro scale, the population growth, the sovereign wealth backing, ADGM infrastructure, controlled supply, freehold timing, residency frameworks, payment structures, yield stability, what emerges is not noise or hype. It feels very deliberate. It feels layered. It feels like longevity. The pace is calmer, but the movement is steady. And personally, that steadiness is what makes it very interesting because you can almost sense the long-term trajectory forming very quietly, even when nothing dramatic is happening on the surface. And I think that the last thing I want to leave you with is that understanding the theory of all of this is not complicated. It's very easy because once you see the data, you see the structure, it usually clicks very quickly. The real part is implementation because everyone's situation is very different. Different budgets, different timelines, different goals. So it's not complicated to understand it, but it does need a little bit of thought to apply it properly in real life. So if this resonated and you're thinking through what this could actually look like for you, the best next step is just to have a proper conversation about it. And you'll find the link to book a private consultation with me in the show notes or just below the video if you're watching this on YouTube. And in the next episode, we're going to go a layer deeper and really break down the different islands in Abu Dhabi. So which ones suit rental strategies, which ones lean more towards lifestyle, and how to think about choosing the right area, choosing the right island based on your goals. And now that you have a clearer picture of Abu Dhabi as a market, the structure, the demand drivers, the way the ecosystem works, the next logical question most people have is actually about entry. How people are entering the UAE property market in the first place. And that includes Dubai. If you want to properly understand how Dubai property pricing and payment plans actually work, how investors are structuring purchases without needing huge lump sums upfront, and why accessibility here often comes down to timing rather than price, make sure that you watch this next video because it really breaks down Dubai's payment plans and affordability in a very practical manner, especially if you've been thinking that you need a lot of money and millions in cash to even begin looking.